6th of January, 1944. The Red Army enters Poland. Marshal Zhukov, probably the Soviet Union's most outstanding commander, had got the bit between his teeth. Soviet armies were advancing on a more than 1,500-kilometer wide front. Though the Germans had insufficient supplies, they were still a formidable fighting force, and in their newest panzers, the Panther and the Tiger, they finally had tanks that could match the famous Russian T-34, but panzer notwithstanding, the Soviet forces' numerical superiority and their momentum pushed the Germans further into Poland and towards Zhukov's first main objective, the Vistula River. '8th of January, 1944. Red Army takes Kirovograd. At Stalingrad, the Soviet army had learned how to stop the German army, amongst other things, benefiting from the infamous Russian winter, particularly fierce in 1943-44. In their drive west, the Red Army had crossed the river Dnieper, in the process taking the town of Kirovograd 115 kilometers west of the river. The German defenses were in a state of disarray, and the Soviet could drive home their attack with artillery and a handful of T-34 tanks without incurring serious losses. It was now possible for the Soviet forces to drive south and cut off all German forces left in the Crimea. '9th of January, 1944. British capture Mongdao in Burma. Burma had been firmly in the hands of Japanese forces since the early part of 1942, Rangoon being captured on 8th of March. The Allies remained on the defensive, though the Chindits, led by Ord Wingate, marched across the mountains back into Burma in early 1943, deploying guerrilla tactics behind the Japanese lines for several months. It wasn't, however, until 1944 that the Allies could mount a serious offensive in the area against the Arakan Peninsula and the town of Mangda, only a few miles from the Burmese-Indian border, now Bangladesh. This was one of the first territorial victories for the British in this theater of war. 15th of January, 1944. Germans retreat to positions around Monte Cassino. After the Allied invasion of Italy, the Germans established the Gustav Line, a strong natural defense line from east to west coast of the country. The only place where there was an even remote chance for the Allies to break through was at Cassino in the Liri Valley, dominated by the Monastery Hill, with its Benedictine monastery, Monte Cassino. The battle for Monte Cassino was, in fact, 4 battles, the first fought through January and February 1944. The Allies advanced directly into a well-organized and stubborn defense and turned into a military disaster for the Americans as they faced an almost sheer climb to the crest of Monte Cassino. 22nd of January 1944, the landing at Anzio. After General Montgomery's British 8th Army had crossed the strait at Messina and the U.S. 5th Army had landed at Salerno, the Allies had a fairly solid grip on southern Italy. However, the Gustav Line still proved to be an insurmountable obstacle, and the Allies decided to land at Anzio to shake this strong German line of defense. Initially, the landing met with very little opposition. In fact, it was some 6 hours before the Allied infantry met any real opposition, and it appeared that the objective of isolating General Weidinghoff's 10th Army was within reach. But the German Field Marshal Kesselring gathered all available forces and counterattacked, halting the American advance. 27th of January 1944. The siege of Leningrad is over. After some 900 days under siege, the city of Leningrad is finally rescued as the Red Army advances on the city. Both the garrison of Leningrad and the civilian population have fought with courage and determination. Of its original 3 million population, only 1.25 million were left. 1.25 million had either been killed or had starved to death, and 500,000 had managed to escape, predominantly across Lake Ladoga. Leningrad had been one of Hitler's main objectives in the Russian campaign, and the total destruction of the city had been specifically mentioned in the Barbarossa Directive of December 18, 1940. 30th of January 1944. U.S. Fifth Army is unsuccessful at the Gustav Line. Despite the landing at Anzio, the U.S. Fifth Army still had an extremely hard time at the Gustav Line, the German defense running across the breadth of Italy, 100 kilometers south of Rome. The Americans relied on fairly traditional attacks, artillery and air bombardment, followed by a frontal infantry attack. But they found themselves trying to advance directly into a well-organized and stubborn defense. Often the Americans managed to reach the crest of the Cassino Ridge, only to be cut down by strategically better-placed defenders. It would be some considerable time before the Americans could break through this formidable defense. 7th of February 1944. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring launches German counterattack at Anzio. The Allied had landed on the beaches of Anzio on the 22nd of January 1944 and had, surprisingly, met with little opposition, the Germans presumably relying on the Gustav Line, whatever side it may be attacked from. But on the 7th of February, Field Marshal Kesselring decides to launch a counterattack. It might be argued that this action had little tactical significance, but it did ensure that the Anzio beachhead stayed isolated from the main Allied forces further south. It would, in fact, be another 3 months before it was possible to break out of Anzio, and then not until Monte Cassino had finally been taken. 14th of February 1945. The bombing of Dresden. On the night of the 13th of February 1945, the RAF had launched an enormous fire raid on the city of Dresden with devastating consequences. Bombs from 800 planes rained down on the city, killing between 135,000 and 250,000, considerably more than perished at Hiroshima a few months later. There is little doubt that the action was punitive, as no military advantage was gained. It does have similarities with both the Blitz on London and the bombing of Coventry in 1941. After the second raid, 80% of the city had been destroyed. February 1944. Truk airfield in harbor wrecked by U.S. naval attack. The Americans had captured the Kwala Lane Atoll faster than expected, and the planned D-Day for the attack on Eniwetok Islands had been moved up from the 1st of May to the 17th of February 1944. The attack was under the command of Admiral Harry Hill, who had 2 bits of good fortune. He was given the use of 8,000 reserves, and Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher attacked the Japanese naval base at Truk. At Truk, the Japanese lost over 270 planes and nearly 400,000 tons of shipping, and the landing on Eniwetok resulted in the total capture of the Marshall Islands. 21st of February 1944. Tojo resigns as Chief of Japanese Army Staff. Hideki Tojo, born in Tokyo in 1884 and the son of an army officer, was an extreme militarist, advocating total war. He became Minister of War in 1940, and in 1941, 2 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, was appointed Prime Minister. Tojo now controlled the government and directed all military operations until 1944, when he had to resign in disgrace because of the change in the fortunes of war. In 1945, Tojo was arrested as a war criminal. He tried to commit suicide but stood trial, was convicted and executed on the 23rd of December, 1948. 22nd of February, 1944. U.S. task force attacks Mariana. After successfully taking Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands, the next obvious target for the Americans in the Pacific was the Marianas, some 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. There was little doubt that the Japanese would defend this strategically important position with some vigor, and that a softening up process might be needed, particularly considering the concentration of Japanese forces on the islands, including a strong Air Force presence. A U.S. task force attacked the Marianas on the 22nd of February 1944 and caused heavy losses to the Japanese Air Force, and paved the way for the even bigger air battle, known as the Mariana Turkey Shoot, later that year. 29th of February 1944. U.S. troops invade Admiralty Islands. The Admiralty Islands are situated just north of Papua New Guinea, and some 4,500 kilometers south of Tokyo. It was yet another small group of islands that had been changed from a tropical paradise into a Japanese fortress. U.S. naval forces start heavy bombardment on the 28th of March 1944, and the following day, the 29th, the Americans land their Marines on the shores of the largest island, Manus, where they managed to establish a strong beachhead. The invasion of the Admiralty Islands was not a major battle, but was yet another piece in the plan that would finally defeat Japan. 1st of March 1944. Chindit 16th Brigade marches into Burma. The Chindits was a corps of British, Burmese, and Gurkha commandos commanded by the innovative Major General Ord Wingate, who fought behind enemy lines in Burma. It had been decided by the British High Command that the Chindit brigades should spearhead the British reoccupation of Burma. One brigade, the 16th, commanded by Bernard Ferguson, walked into position from Ledo in India to Manton in Burma, crossing the border on the 1st of March 1944. The brigade set up a stronghold named Aberdeen that became a springboard for the ensuing Burmese campaign. 5th of March 1944. RAF raid against Bordeaux. By early 1944, the Allies had gained air superiority on the Western Front and launched daily strikes against enemy targets on mainland Europe. On the 5th of March 1944, the RAF mounted a massive raid on the French port of Bordeaux, heavily defended by the Luftwaffe and ACAC. More than 1,000 bombers with fighter cover were engaged in the mission. The successful raid was so massive that bombers still 30 minutes away from the target met the first wave as it was returning. The damage to the port was significant and RAF losses comparatively light. 6th of March 1944. Soviet Army drives forward on a wide front in the Ukraine. The Red Army was moving at speed in the early spring of 1944, driving the retreating German armies in front of them. Marshal Zhukov drove his armies in a huge arc through Khorestan, and on 6th of March he cut down through Rovno. Whilst in the south, the German commander Manstein had thrown everything he could find into the defense of the Odessa low rail link. But the Germans were thrown back over the river Pruth, and virtually the whole eastern front was being pushed back through the Ukraine. It was by now evident that the Soviet forces finally were in the process of ridding their country of the invaders. 9th of March 1944. Japanese launch offensive on Bougainville. Bougainville in the Solomon Islands had been under U.S. control since February 1943 and was used by the Americans as an airbase, ideally suited for forays into Japanese-occupied Papua New Guinea and beyond. However, on the 9th of March 1944, the Japanese launch an offensive on the island with a large force in an attempt to halt the Allied advance. It turned out to be a bitter fight with large casualties on both sides, but the Americans refused to budge, and after being decimated to a fraction of their original strength, the Japanese had to abandon their quest, and the Americans remained in control. 18th of March 1944. Heavy air raid on Hamburg. Whilst the American Air Force Bomber Command mounted an increasing number of daylight raids on Germany, RAF Bomber Command still favored night raids. The German military historian, former Luftwaffe Colonel, Dr. Guth, who has carried out extensive research on the Hamburg night bombings, is convinced that they were meant as terror bombings.
It was more or less not a military attack, but it was just to create a fireball over the town and to hit the population.
It is indeed doubtful whether night bombings could designate particular military or industrial targets, a fact that supports Dr. Guth's claim. 29th of March 1944. The Siege of Impal. The Indian city of Impal, close to the border with Burma, was strategically importantly placed. Whilst a strong Japanese force was driving north through the Tidham-Impal Road, pushing back the 17th Indian, other Japanese troops were moving with speed to cut that road at Tongzang and to capture the Manipur Bridge. There was heavy fighting around Tongzang and the Manipur Bridge, and the Japanese managed to occupy strategically important positions, curtailing Allied movement. It was obviously the Japanese intention to take Impal, but the defense mounted was too strong, and by the 29th of March 1944, the city was merely surrounded, but under siege. 30th of March 1944, RAF raids Nuremberg. On the night of the 30th of March 1944, 795 heavy RAF bombers were sent out to attack the city of Nuremberg. The raid was a disaster. The winds had been wrongly forecast, and the stream of bombers had strayed from their safe route to the target. Junkers 88 and Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighters could claim several victims, while the Pathfinder crew's inaccurate navigation resulted in only a handful of bombers identifying Nuremberg, most dropping their loads on neighboring towns and villages. No less than 95 Halifaxes and Lancasters failed to return to their bases, and a dozen crashed in England. The 9th of May 1944. Sevastopol is taken. The spring campaign in 1944 had gone well for the Soviet Union, but there was one important task remaining, the defeat of the German forces in the Crimea. The job was given to General Tolbunkin's 4th Ukrainian Front, supported by the new Coastal Army under General Eremenko, a force that totaled 470,000 men. The German forces were quickly overrun and fled into the city of Sevastopol, and in early May the Soviets launched an attack on the city itself. It took 4 days of intense bombardment, followed by street-to-street fighting, but on the 9th of May, Sevastopol was controlled by the Red Army. The 11th of May, 1944. U.S. 5th and British 8th Armies joined forces at the Gustav Line. The German defense line in Italy, the Gustav Line, had proven a hard nut to crack for the Allied forces. In early May 1944, 3 major battles had been fought in an attempt to break through with emphasis on the positions around Monte Cassino. A 4th attempt got underway with better hope of success. The U.S. 5th and the British 8th Armies had joined forces on the 11th of May. As usual, the offensive started with massed artillery fire, but this time the Allies attacked with overwhelming strength, and a breakthrough was made by the French in the mountains, and Monte Cassino itself would certainly fall within days. The 18th of May 1944, Monte Cassino falls. After the U.S. 5th and the British 8th Armies had joined forces at the Gustav Line, the Allies had launched their strongest and most determined attack on the German defense line. On the 18th of May 1944, the French had broken through in the mountains, and at Monte Cassino itself, the Polish Second Corps had surged forward to take the monastery. The rush was finally successful. The Allied could take possession of the Cassino Ridge, and the road through to Rome was cleared. The Allies could now continue their advance north after months' delay, and Rome was to be taken the following month. The 2nd of June 1944. Eisenhower inspects Allied troops ready for D-Day. The build-up to the invasion of France, D-Day, had been the largest task ever undertaken by the Allies on the Western Front. More than 250,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen were to take part. The Allied commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was acutely aware that the morale of his men was as important as guns, tanks, ships, and aircraft. On the 2nd of June 1944, 4 days before D-Day, Eisenhower visits many of the troops waiting in southern England, assuring them that the task ahead will be successful. There's nothing left to do but wait for the right weather for the crossing to Normandy. The 3rd of June 1944. Allied troops are poised to take Rome. After the hard and prolonged fighting at Monte Cassino, General Mark Clark was determined that Rome should be the prize of the U.S. Fifth Army. Clark's obstinacy in securing the Holy City for the glory of the Americans wasn't popular amongst British, Polish, French, New Zealand, Moroccan, and Indian troops who had stormed the heights of Monte Cassino 4 times, and on the eve of the taking of the city, the 3rd of June 1944, wanted to participate in a cooperative strike. But Clark got his way. On the 4th of June, victorious American troops entered Rome, declared an open city, through streets lined with jubilant Italians. The 6th of June 1944, D-Day. The landing in Normandy was one of the most complex and intricate operations in the history of warfare. The landing involved more than 250,000 men, nearly 5,000 ships, scores of fighter and bomber squadrons, 1,200 transport planes, 20,000 paratroopers, not to mention many hundred thousands of support personnel. The invasion came as the intended surprise for the Germans. The weather had been bad for days, and furthermore, they expected any landing to take place in the Pas-de-Calais area. As a result, it was possible for the Allied forces to establish a beachhead already on the first day, though still against some serious opposition. The 15th of June 1944, U.S. troops land on Saipan. The Marianas Island, roughly 2,400 kilometers southeast of Tokyo, was the scene of the most ambitious operation in the history of amphibious warfare. It was a superbly executed operation, and on the morning of the 15th of June 1944, they stormed ashore on the island of Saipan under cover of massive artillery and air bombardment, meeting fierce opposition from 30,000 Japanese troops, having the benefit of deep bunkers and concrete blockhouses. By nightfall, 20,000 Marines had been landed, but were largely pinned down on the beaches by Japanese fire from higher vantage positions. The Americans would have to fight for every inch of Saipan. The 18th of June 1944. Soviet Army breaks through the Mannerheim Line. The so-called continuation war between Finland and the Soviet Union had enjoyed a prolonged standstill when Red Army forces broke through the Mannerheim Line on the 18th of June 1944. The Soviets were in the ascendancy on all fronts that summer, enjoying unprecedented military successes on virtually all fronts, and things were not going to be different against the Finns. Though the Finnish army fought bravely and with determination, they didn't, as during previous encounters, have the advantage of the winter, which in this particular confrontation did not favor the Russians, and they had to sue for peace within 3 months. The 19th of June 1944. Battle of the Philippine Sea. The invasion of Saipan on the 15th of June 1944 forces the Japanese to react in strength, as American bombers could now reach Japan itself. To avoid this, the Imperial Japanese Navy decided to throw in its remaining carriers and air crews. The Battle of the Philippine Sea got underway on the 18th of June, when the main Japanese force moved into position west of the Marianas. The Japanese fighters and bombers were met by a strong U.S. force and sustained heavy losses. On the 19th of June, both forces moved northwest and recommenced the battle. The air battle was later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, due to the Americans' great superiority. The 27th of June 1944. German pocket near Vitebsk destroyed. The Soviet summer offensive had opened on the 22nd of June 1944, when 15 armies, supported by aircraft and tanks, moved forward with the objective to obliterate the German Army Group Center, more than 1 million men, with 1,000 panzers and 1,400 aircraft. Within a week, the 3 main bastions of the German defense had been cut off and subsequently captured. Vitebsk, in the north, fell on the 27th of June to converging attacks from one army of Bagramyan's 1st Baltic Front and one of Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front. This was the onslaught which would clear the invaders from the soil of Mother Russia. 29th of June 1944. U.S. forces liberate Cherbourg. At the end of June 1944, there were some worried men in London and Washington. The landing in Normandy had gotten off to a successful start, but after a couple of weeks the operation was falling behind schedule. The massive Allied onslaught, Operation Goodwood, that had been launched on the 18th of June, had only advanced the front a few miles, and the British Second Army was only edging its way towards the city of Caen. The U.S. Fifth Army had operated further west and had not captured Cherbourg until the 29th of June. So the invasion program was seriously behind schedule. The question begged, could the Germans actually turn the tide? 3rd of July 1944. Two Soviet spearheads meet at Minsk. The Russian summer offensive had been opened 3 years to the day after Operation Barbarossa had been launched. The Soviet forces were pushing back the German armies with almost blitzkrieg speed, their T-34s outnumbering and often outshooting the German panzers. Vitebsk had been taken on the 27th of June 1944, and on the 3rd of July, two Red Army spearheads met at the important city of Minsk, only 450 kilometers east of Warsaw. Within a week, most of the German armies were back over the pre-war Polish borders. In fact, the Soviet momentum never flagged, and the Germans were in retreat everywhere. 4th of July 1944. U.S. Marines push ahead on Saipan. The Japanese resistance on Saipan had been one of the fiercest throughout the war, as they fought for every inch of the island. But American determination made it possible to start a drive on the 4th of July 1944, and the end came 3 days later when U.S. forces repulsed the biggest recorded Banzai attack. What followed was worse than the battle itself, but just one more of the many tragedies of the war. Japanese propaganda had convinced the civilian population that the Americans would torture them, and thousands of Saipanese killed themselves and their families, some by throwing their children and themselves off the high northern cliffs onto the jagged rocks below. 7th of July 1944. British Second Army attacked Caen. It had been a great disappointment that the town of Caen hadn't been taken early in the campaign in Normandy, and to make matters worse, the Germans had the opportunity to reinforce the defenses. The British Second Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey, had been slowly edging its way towards Caen since the middle of June. Montgomery had actually stated as early as 11th of June 1944 that his objective was to draw as many enemy forces as possible towards the Second Army, taking the pressure off the 1st U.S. Army under General Omar Bradley, which was moving towards Cherbourg. Now that Cherbourg had fallen, the British launched a major attack on Caen. The 9th of July 1944, Caen taken by the British. Caen was an important town already in the 10th century when the Duchy of Normandy was formed. The Allies, after a protracted campaign to reach the town, had launched a decisive attack on the 7th of July 1944, supported by RAF Bomber Command. Caen was very heavily defended, and the British Second Army, spearheading the attack, didn't enter the town until the 9th of July. It had been a hard-fought victory with heavy casualties on both sides, in addition to which thousands of Germans were taken prisoner. It is doubtful whether Caen's strategical position justified this level of military attention. The 17th of July 1944, Rommel's staff car is attacked by RAF aircraft. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been appointed commander of Army Group B, the German forces on the Channel coast, and despite the illnesses he had endured the previous year, the Allies were well aware that the Desert Fox was still a formidable opponent. It would obviously be a great coup if Rommel could be taken out of the equation, and several plans had been tabled. However, as luck would have it, Rommel was shot by an RAF aircraft while driving his staff car near Liverot on the 17th of July 1944. Rommel's skull was fractured in 3 places, his cheekbone shattered, and his left eye badly damaged. A big blow to the German defense efforts in Normandy. The 18th of July 1944. Operation Goodwood. Operation Goodwood, one of the many carefully planned operations in Normandy during the weeks that followed D-Day, was launched on the 18th of July 1944. The objective was to engage the German armor in battle and ride it down to such an extent that it would have no further value. It was the biggest armored offensive carried out by the British up to that time. 3 divisions were launched from the Orne bridgehead, supported by artillery and 2,000 bombers and naval shelling. The battle lasted through to the 20th of July, and though territorial gains were limited, the objective of diminishing German panzer capabilities in the sector had largely been achieved. The 20th of July, 1944. Attempt on Hitler's life. By the summer of 1944, it was obvious to all German military leaders, except the most fanatic, that defeat was only a question of time. The main obstacle to sue for peace was Adolf Hitler himself, and on the 20th of July an attempt was made on his life. The July bomb plot had been planned by a group of concerned officers who believed that the removal of Hitler might save their country. The bomb was placed in an army headquarters Hitler was visiting. It went off as planned, but did not kill the German Führer. Virtually everybody involved in the plot was rounded up and summarily executed, whilst Hitler, though only slightly injured, never returned to full physical and mental fitness. The 21st of July, 1944. U.S. Marines land on Guam. The battle for the Marianas was extremely costly for both the Americans and the Japanese. U.S. Marines had landed on Eniwetok with 20,000 men and had experienced a surprisingly fierce Japanese defense from the commanding heights above the beaches. It wasn't until the 21st of July that the Americans could land a force on the island of Guam, and here they met the same type of almost fanatical defense they had experienced on Eniwetok. The capture of Guam and the smaller island Tinian took through to the 12th of August to complete, and cost the Americans more than 20,000 casualties and the Japanese in excess of 40,000. The 27th of July, 1944. U.S. forces break through west of St. Lo in Normandy. At the end of July 1944, the U.S. First Army under General Omar Bradley had been bogged down in the bocage country around Cherbourg in Normandy. Bocage is hard hedgerows that make movement of vehicles, even tanks, extremely difficult. Shortly after launching Operation Cobra to take all of Brittany and the vital ports of Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire, American tank crews were out of the bocage and could stream forward. On the 27th of July, the Americans broke through west of St. Lo and moved into Avranches and crossed the Sélune River. Brittany was now open to them. The 29th of July, 1944. Soviet spearhead reaches Baltic coast near Riga. The Red Army's great summer offensive was still having the Germans retreating on all fronts, and on the 29th of July, 1944, a Soviet armored spearhead, commanded by General Bagramyan, reached the Baltic Sea near Riga, the capital of Latvia. Equally significant at that time was General Rokossovsky's drive towards Brest-Litovsk, further south, which was taken on the same day. This now opened up for an offensive into Poland, and within days Rokossovsky had reached the River Bug at a point north of Warsaw. The 30th of July, 1944. First U.S. Army reaches Avranches. The Allied campaign in Normandy and Brittany had changed significantly at the end of July 1944, when General Omar Bradley's U.S. First Army had finally broken out of the bocage, hedgerow country, around Cherbourg and reached a point just west of St. Lo. The First Army could now push south towards Avranches, where they crossed the Sélune River with Brittany, and indeed the whole northwest of France open to them. This had been an extremely significant campaign and caused the commander of the U.S. 30th Division, Major General Leland Hobbs, to state, apparently quite animatedly, "This thing has burst wide open. We may be the spearhead that broke the camel's back." The 31st of July, 1944, start of the Warsaw Uprising. In 1944, most of the Polish resistance was concentrated in the capital, Warsaw. With the Soviet forces approaching the city, the commander of the Home Army, General Tadeusz Komorowski, decided it was an opportune time to try and expel the Germans. The Warsaw Uprising started on the 31st of July, 1944, and the Poles managed to take control of the city, but waited in vain for assistance from Rokossovski's armies positioned a few miles to the north on the River Bug. The Poles were quickly running low on both food and ammunition, and when the Soviets denied the Allies the use of nearby airfield to help the beleaguered Poles, the end was inevitable. The 1st of August 1944, General George Patton takes command of U.S. Third Army. General Patton took command of the U.S. Third Army on the 1st of August 1944. George Smith Patton was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California, and educated at the U.S. Military Academy with the rank of second lieutenant. In France, during World War I, Patton established a tank training school and commanded a tank brigade, and would later, in World War II, show that his talent was on par with Guderian and maybe even with Rommel himself. His role during the Battle of Normandy had already been significant, and with the new responsibilities he would go on to show that he was the Allies' most outstanding tank commander. The 2nd of August 1944. General Rokossovski's troops stop outside Warsaw. The Warsaw Uprising had started on the 31st of July 1944, with General Tadeusz Komorowski commanding the Home Army, whilst it was the aim of the Poles to take control of their capital before the Soviet forces arrived. By the 2nd of August, General Rokossovski was approaching the outskirts of Warsaw and stopped his advance. From a military point of view, there was no reason for this sudden inaction. So was the reason political? It is possible to speculate, but the facts are that the Polish forces in Warsaw were destroyed, as was a large part of the civil infrastructure, and the country was left utterly vulnerable. 3rd of August 1944. Rennes in Brittany is liberated by Allied troops. The U.S. Third Army had reached the Sélune River at Avranches on the 30th of July 1944, considered in military terms to be the gateway to Brittany and, as was later to be proved, the whole of northwestern France. The American crossing of the Sélune went almost unopposed, and the next objective was the city of Rennes, approximately 80 kilometers further south. Rennes was liberated by U.S. forces on the 3rd of August. Bradley, Patton, and Montgomery agreed that Brittany had to be secured quickly so that the Allied efforts could be concentrated on the main objective, the heart of France in the east, Paris and the Seine. The 4th of August 1944. 8th Army reaches Florence in northern Italy. After securing Rome, which had been declared an open city, on the 4th of June 1944, the road north appeared open to the Allies, but Operation Overlord had meant that several divisions were more urgently needed in Normandy, and as a result, the drive up through Italy lost some of its momentum. Meanwhile, the Germans had established their last line of defense in Italy, the Gothic Line, running just north of Florence to Pesaro on the Adriatic coast. Though slowed down, the 8th Army continued north, fighting German delaying rearguard action, and reached Florence on the 4th of August 1944, now poised to attack the Gothic Line. The 10th of August 1944. Nantes is liberated. The Allied were in a hurry to clear Brittany so they could concentrate on the all-important drive east towards the Seine and Paris. Rennes had been taken on the 3rd of August 1944, and then the Allies could swing towards the south and the city of Nantes, and equally important, away from the delaying hedgerows, so particular to this area of France. Whilst the U.S. 12th Corps entered Nantes, General Patton, ever eager to get to grips with the enemy, headed south and southeast, feeling that his work in Normandy had been done. 11th of August 1944. Angers is liberated. The U.S. 12th Corps had continued its progress after taking Nantes and could liberate the town of Angers without encountering too much opposition from German forces. At the same time, the U.S. 15th Corps had taken Château-Gonchie and Laval, and General Patton's newly constituted U.S. Third Army continued to move south from Laval to take Le Mans. This move made it possible for the British Second Army to create a pincer which would encircle von Kluge's German Army Group B. 13th of August, 1944. Argentan is liberated. After the fall of Nantes, the American forces continued their cleanup, and the town of Argentan was taken after some fierce defending by the German army. The fortunes of war on the Western Front were now decidedly in the Allies' favor, and the Führer was not even given a chance to mount an argument. Many of his commanders were in headlong flight, and thousands of German troops were surrendering to advancing American and British armies. In the Argentan area, the Allies took some 50,000 prisoners and buried more than 10,000 German dead, and captured 380 armored vehicles, 700 artillery pieces, and 5,000 trucks. 15th of August, 1944. Allied troops land in southern France. The third major amphibious landing in Europe, of 44, took place between Saint-Raphael and La Lavandou on the French Riviera. The U.S. 7th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Patch, landed with the support of a fleet of more than 1,000 ships. The area was defended by the German 19th Army, part of Colonel General von Blaskewicz's Army Group G, by now down on its normal strength through heavy losses in Normandy. The Allies fired some 50,000 shells on the German defenses prior to the landing, and the Luftwaffe only managed a token appearance. 19th of August, 1944. Two German armies surrounded in the Falaise pocket. The rapid Allied advances in Normandy had created a pocket around the town of Falaise, where large German forces were getting entrapped, notably because Hitler refused to let them retreat. However, the Allies did not close the trap, as surprisingly Patton was ordered to stop his advance, an action that made SS General Sepp Dietrich ignore Hitler's orders and get 1st SS Panzer Corps out when there was still time. It was none too early, as the Canadians and the U.S. 5th Corps finally closed the ring, trapping the remaining German forces. The fall of Falaise finally cost the Germans some 60,000 men. The 20th of August, 1944. Soviet starts offensive against Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. 15 Soviet armies had started a summer offensive in June of 1944 to finally obliterate the German Army Group Center. On the 20th of August, the 52nd Army of Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front broke through the defenses of the German Army Group Ukraine in the Pruth Valley. A Soviet tank army immediately followed, whilst another mechanized corps advanced into Bessarabia, thereby totally isolating the German Sixth Army. A coup d'etat in Bucharest then followed, and the Romanian armies laid down their weapons. 24th of August, 1944. Paris liberated. If General Eisenhower had been given a choice, he would have bypassed Paris during the French campaign, waiting until the Germans decided to surrender, as supplies could become a problem. However, politically there was no choice, and it was decided, on the insistence of General de Gaulle, that the French 2nd Armored Division, commanded by the brilliant General Jacques Leclerc, should lead the drive into the French capital, though supported by the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. Unfortunately, enthusiasm won over caution, and both formations suffered on the approach, the 2nd Armored losing 71 killed, 225 wounded, but it was finally a triumphant procession. 25th of August, 1944. German forces in Paris surrender. Though Allied forces had entered the French capital triumphantly the day before, there was still some mopping up to do, as the German soldiers were aware of the treatment they would receive in the hands of French civilians once they put down their arms. The German commandant of Paris, General Dietrich von Cholitz, wasn't captured until 3 p.m., and even after he had signed a formal instrument of surrender, fighting continued for some hours. Altogether, 1,600 French soldiers and civilians died in Paris that day, as did nearly 3,000 Germans, and there was a total of more than 8,500 wounded. 30th of August, 1944. Soviet forces take Ploesti. The oil fields in Ploesti in southern Romania were the major source of oil for Germany throughout most of the war. Ploesti was repeatedly bombed by the air forces of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. In fact, the first U.S. raid on the oil refineries at Ploesti on the 1st of August 1943 was one of the largest of the war, destroying almost 50% of the production capacity. Though Romania had sued for peace with the Allies on the 26th of August 1944, Ploesti was still strongly defended by the Germans, but superior Soviet forces finally took the town and the oil fields on the 30th of August. 4th of September 1944. Antwerp is liberated. The British Second Army had reached and entered Brussels on the 3rd of September 1944. A strategically more important objective in Belgium was obviously the city of Antwerp, with its deep-sea port. For the Allied campaign on mainland Europe to succeed, an efficient line of supply was paramount, and this reasonably undamaged harbor could play an important role. The German defenders fought back fiercely, using all available means, including V-2 rockets, but already, the day after having liberated Brussels, the British Second Army was at the gates of Antwerp. (11th of September 1944. First U.S. patrol crosses Germany's border. The U.S. First Army had participated in the liberation of Paris, but the day after the U.S. 4th Division arrived in the French capital, other divisions of General Hodges' First Army crossed the Seine and after a number of small battles began a drive which for speed and excitement outmatched even the race of Patton's divisions. Hodges then sent forward divisions of his 5th Corps along the valleys of the Somme and Meuse rivers towards the German city of Aachen, where, on the 11th of September 1944, a single patrol became the first Allied troops to cross the border into Germany itself. 12th of September 1944. U.S. First Army crosses Germany's border near Aachen. A single patrol had crossed the German border on the 11th of September 1944, and by the 12th, the main force of the U.S. First Army was poised to follow. The German defenses in the area were surprisingly subdued. Allied commanders had expected serious counter-resistance when the Vaterland itself was threatened. However, pragmatism won over nationalism, as the Rhine River, a few miles further east, would be a far better bastion against the enemy. General Hodges' 1st U.S. Army then moved towards the next obvious target, the city of Cologne, situated on the protective waterway. 18th of September 1944. German mount heavy counterattacks against Allied airborne positions in Holland. The Allies had launched their biggest airborne attack on 17th of September 1944, employing over 15,400 aircraft and 478 gliders, taking off from 22 airfields. The German High Command was aware of the impact a successful assault on the Rhine bridges could have and mounted a heavy counterattack. What followed was in many ways an uneven battle, as lightly armed paratroopers were confronted by German panzer and artillery, and this chapter in the war on the Western Front did result in heavy Allied casualties. 23rd of September 1944. U.S. forces land on Ulithi. Regular bombing of Japan was imminent when U.S. forces had taken possession of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam by August 1944, as these islands could accommodate bases for the new long-range bombers, the B-29 superfortresses. This fact meant that there was a less urgent need for actions in the Philippines and the Carolines. though the Americans nonetheless went ahead as planned with landing in the Western Carolines at Peleliu on 15th of September 1944 and on Ulithi just over a week later on the 23rd of September. 30th of September 1944, Canadians take Calais. After the liberation of Paris and the crossing of the Seine, the Allied forces embarked on a campaign against important towns in northern France to clear the route into Belgium and Holland, and naturally Germany itself. The American and British troops advanced into Luxembourg and Belgium, where recently promoted Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery occupied Antwerp. The Canadians were left to mop up the quite strongly defended French coastal towns, Boulogne, Dunkirk, and Calais, and it wasn't until the 30th of September 1944 that they managed to take Calais. The 11th of October 1944, U.S. aircraft attack Luzon. There had been some debate amongst American military commanders about the next target, but General MacArthur won the argument, and it was decided that the Philippines would be it. Prior to an attempt to land forces on the islands, the Japanese air power had to be weakened as much as possible, and one of their major bases was the Clark Airfield on Luzon, north of the capital, Manila. Consequently, on the 11th of October, 1944, U.S. carrier-borne aircraft attacked targets on Luzon as preparations for the landing planned for the 24th of October. "14th of October 1944, Rommel dies. Field Marshal Erwin Eugene Rommel died on the 14th of October 1944. He was only 53 years of age, but had had a spectacular career after joining the German army in 1910. Rommel's exploits in North Africa earned him the Field Marshal's baton and the name the Desert Fox. In 1944, he commanded the German armies defending northern France, but was forced to resign when he was accused of complicity in the attempt on Hitler's life in July 1944. It is believed by many political commentators and historians that Rommel, in fact, took poison rather than stand trial. 20th of October 1944, U.S. forces land on Leyte. More than 700 Allied transport and warships were being assembled east of the Philippine island of Leyte on the 20th of October 1944. Scores of aircraft were patrolling overhead. Within days, the landings on Leyte brought the Japanese Plan Show 1 into operation. This plan, a naval engagement, was designed to disrupt and hopefully destroy the landings. Meanwhile, the land action on Leyte was fierce as the Japanese forces there threw in everything to repel the American forces, who managed to establish and hold an initial beachhead until, in less than a week, the naval engagement had been won. 24th of October 1944, Battle of Leyte Gulf. Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, supporting the landing of the U.S. Sixth Army, was in fact a series of air-sea battles spread over a vast area. It was not only the climax of the war in the Pacific, but also the greatest naval battle in history. All the classic warship types were engaged, from battleships and carriers down to destroyer escorts. The Japanese High Command knew at this time that defeat was staring their country in the face and could only hope that a gamble of an all-out offensive by their remaining capital ships might stop Allied progress. The Japanese plan, named Show 1, almost worked, but only almost, as the Americans eventually took the Philippines. 27th of October 1944, kamikaze attack U.S. naval forces in the Philippines. The Japanese had lost a substantial fleet during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. At the conclusion, the tally was 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers against American losses of 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 2 submarines. The following day, the 27th of October, the Japanese resorted to desperate measures and launched a kamikaze attack against U.S. naval forces in the vain but unrealistic hope that this would help to restore the military balance of power. But, as had so often been the case in armed conflict, it was too little, too late. 7th of November 1944, Roosevelt elected president for a fourth term. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been in politics since his election to the New York State Senate in 1910, aged 28. In 1929, he started what was to become 2 terms as governor of New York, eventually to stand for the presidency in 1932, winning on his famous New Deal platform. The war years saw the popular president steer his country through some of the most dangerous times in its history and secured the USA a permanent leading role in the world, and it did not come as a major surprise when Thomas E. Dewey was defeated in the 1944 election, leading to Roosevelt's unprecedented fourth term in office. 12th of November 1944, RAF Lancasters sink to Pitts in Tromsø Fjord. The German battleship Tirpitz was anchored in the Alten Fjord in the northernmost province of Norway during September 1944, too far away for RAF Lancasters to make a return flight from any base in the United Kingdom. So No. 9 and 617 squadrons flew to Jagodnik from where they attacked on the 15th, but only one bomb struck the battleship. The Tirpitz was then moved further south to the port of Tromsø for repairs, and on the 12th of November, the same 2 squadrons of Lancasters mounted a raid on the German warship. Tirpitz capsized and was effectively put out of action for the duration. 21st of November 1944. Fierce fighting on Tarawa. Betio Island, part of the Tarawa Atoll, saw some of the most ferocious fighting in the Pacific. It was here that the Americans discovered that Japanese troops were literally prepared to fight to the last man. U.S. forces had landed on the Macon and Tarawa atolls on the 20th of November 1944 against very heavy opposition. It appeared to most Marines that every single square inch had to be paid for in blood. The next morning, another battalion of the 8th Marines managed to land on Betio Island. In addition, 2 Marine companies managed to break through and help secure the whole western end of the island. 24th of November 1944. Allies cross the Saar. The Allied forces in Europe were still forging ahead and were often met with little or no resistance from the Germans. Even the Vaterland's natural defenses, the rivers running south to north, were crossed with a minimum of effort. The Moselle and the Rhine had posed few problems for the advancing American and British troops. On the 24th of November 1944, U.S. forces crossed the River Saar. However, soft targets would be harder to come by over the weeks ahead. The Germans now saw the writing on the wall and were preparing for their biggest and last counter-offensive on the Western Front, the Battle of the Bulge. 27th of November 1944. Heinrich Himmler gives order to stop the executions in the concentration camps. By the end of November 1944, it was clear to all but the most stubbornly blind Nazis that Germany was going to lose the war. SS Heinrich Himmler, in charge of the numerous concentration camps throughout Germany and Poland, realized that the end was near, and that furthermore, the atrocities in the camps could not subsequently be accepted by the victors. Himmler had consequently ordered cessation of all further executions, obviously not understanding that the inhumanities that had been carried out for years could not be easily swept under the carpets. The chances and the hopes are that it will never be forgotten. 29th of November 1944. Soviet army crosses the Danube. Russian armies under the command of Generals Malinovsky and Tolbukin were confronted by German reinforcements in Hungary. After the Hungarian leader, Admiral Horthy, had withdrawn his country from the Axis, the German High Command ordered the armies in Austria to defend the city of Budapest against the advancing Soviet forces who were fighting their way north on either side of the Hungarian capital. The progress was slow and laborious, and the casualties were extremely high on both sides. The push completely lacked the momentum of earlier campaigns, but finally, on the 29th of November, 1944, the Russians could cross the important Danube River. 14th of December, 1944, U.S. aircraft attacked Japanese airfields on Luzon. By mid-December 1944, American forces, including General Kruger's 6th Army, had been facing stubborn Japanese resistance in the Philippines for a couple of months, but still determined to take all of the islands. The Japanese had so far managed to hang on to some vital airfields from where they could mount bombing runs against U.S. land forces and against the carriers supplying both artillery and air cover. On the 14th of December, the Americans launched a serious attack on the remaining Japanese airfields on the island of Luzon, now against surprisingly little opposition, and caused significant and irreversible damage to the Imperial air powers. 15th of December 1944, U.S. forces land on Mindoro to build airfields. American aircraft had attacked Japanese airfields on the island of Luzon in the Philippines on the 14th of December 1944. The attack was predominantly carried out by carrier-borne planes, and it was of paramount importance for the Americans to establish their own airfields in the area. So the day after the attack on Luzon, on the 15th of December, U.S. forces land on the island of Mindoro, south of Manila, in order to build their own airfields. The operation was successfully executed, and literally within days, the first Allied combat aircraft could be brought in and start to make sorties against enemy targets. 16th of December 1944, start of the Battle of the Bulge. The Allied had enjoyed almost total success in Europe since the D-Day landing in Normandy during the summer of 1944. Patton's tanks had raced through to Germany itself, Paris had been liberated, and Montgomery's forces had entered both Brussels and Antwerp. It was probably inevitable that the Germans would mount a counteroffensive, and on the 16th of December, taking advantage of weather that kept Allied aircraft grounded, their panzers swept through the hilly and wooded Ardennes country and advanced 50 kilometers into Belgium and Luxembourg, thus launching the Battle of the Bulge. The aim of the operation was to divide the British and Americans and retake the vital port of Antwerp. 21st of December 1944. U.S. 101st Airborne Division besieged at Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge had been launched on the 16th of December 1944 and had the ambitious, if unrealistic, aim of taking the port of Antwerp. The German push had created a salient, the Bulge, stretching into Belgium. The salient came under immediate attack by Montgomery's forces in the north, and in the south, the 82nd and 101st U.S. Airborne Divisions had raced north from Patton's lines. The 82nd went on to St. Vith, whilst the 101st stopped at Bastogne and began its famous stand against a German onslaught until relieved by Patton's advancing armor 5 days later. 22nd of December 1944. Germans blocked on their drive to the Meuse. It had been Hitler's intention to retake the port of Antwerp when the counteroffensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, was launched. However, not all German commanders thought that a realistic target. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's reaction was immediate and scathing. "Antwerp? If we reach the Meuse, we should go down on our knees and thank God." And even that goal would prove elusive. General Manteuffel's panzers probed further and further west, and the 11th Panzer Division nearly reached the town of Dinant on the Meuse, but no German force actually crossed the river. 23rd of December 1944. Fortunes change during the Battle of the Bulge as the weather changes. Ever since the Germans launched their counteroffensive from the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, the weather had been so densely foggy that the Allies had to fight without air cover. Fortunately, changes were on their way, and on the 23rd of December 1944, the icy winter fog had lifted, and British and American fighters and bombers could again take to the air. This made a significant change to the military balance of power, as the German Luftwaffe basically had outplayed its role and no longer posed any serious threat. This offensive would prove to be the last major German effort to avoid the inevitable outcome of the war, their ultimate defeat. 27th of December 1944. Soviet army completes the encirclement of Budapest. Though the Hungarian leader, Admiral Horthy, never an enthusiastic Nazi, had withdrawn from the pact with Germany on the 16th of October 1944, there were still Hungarian forces fighting. In fact, the Soviet leaders decided that with 180,000 German and Hungarian troops within Budapest, there was little chance of taking the city by storm, and they therefore organized a full-scale siege, calling up super-heavy artillery from hundreds of miles back in the Soviet Union. The encirclement was completed on the 27th of December, though the final assault had to wait until 1945. 30th of December 1944. Colonel Rudel is celebrated. Hans Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated officer in the German Luftwaffe, had become a legend in his own lifetime and was celebrated by the Nazi hierarchy when on leave from the Eastern Front, where he had destroyed more than 600 enemy tanks. He was to be captured by the British and was clearly not universally liked.
He said to us, give me a Spitfire and put your two finest fighter pilots at 2,000 feet over the airfield. I will take off, shoot them both down, and go home to Germany. That was his arrogance.